I know that a number of you may be interested in asking questions. I'm sure there'll be a chance to do that. Perhaps Catherine will look at that later. And a number of you may also be focused on the 11 plus. So to avoid disappointment, I'll explain that. I'm going to talk rather wider about school admissions, particularly in Birmingham first. And then, of course, I will talk about the 11 plus admissions process and answer any specific questions on that later. So what I'm going to be talking about today is primarily admissions within Birmingham local authority. However, this discussion is going to very much match up whether you're in Solihull, Warwickshire, Walsall or Staffordshire. However, if you're in Worcestershire, it is a rather different admission system where they have a slightly different middle school, high school system and also far fewer choices. So it's a little bit different in Worcestershire. So I'll get started with, going back to our responsibilities as parents, what we think about in terms of our children's education and how school admissions ultimately work. And I'm going to be talking about both primary and secondary school admissions. I know that this will be recorded, and so hopefully it's going to get to a lot of people for whom this is really useful information. I often do talk to parents who are new to the UK itself. They may have come from Europe or further abroad, and so the whole system is slightly different. I would say that in terms of admissions for some local authorities, for example, near London, it's a very different system. So this is not necessarily suitable for somebody in a completely different local authority outside of the Midlands to understand. So obviously, our first responsibility as parents in raising our children is the love and the care that we give to them. And one thing that I can genuinely say before we start talking about schools is that in my years of experience, what really, really matters to a child, what really ensures their growth as a human being and their academic growth and their academic success, it really boils down to the home and the parents more than the school. It really does. And ultimately, this is the most important pivot of a child's life is, the support that they're getting from home, the interest that parents show in their education. So parents could pay a whole load of money, they could send their child to the very top schools, but if they're not really showing interest in their child and in their child's education, that's not going to work as well as, in my experience, a parent who just sends their child to the local inner city school but shows continued support and interest and dedication to their child's education. That is what is more important. So the way that the UK education system works as a whole is that, unlike perhaps some Northern European countries, it's a very stratified system. And your admission into school very much depends on one of these things. I'll start with special needs because it's at the bottom of the list. It's worthwhile saying at the beginning that if a child has a statement of special needs, I don't just mean on the special needs register or with some form of special needs, which a significant percentage of children have. I mean an actual statement of special needs, then they will attend the school that is listed on their statement. And so therefore that child is pretty much out of this system. You work with your local authority advisor. Your child will be attending, for example, a special school or a school that can provide for your child's special needs. So for example, if a child had mobility problems, they would look at the schools in your area and name a school that, for example, has a lift or not have stairs, and that would be the right school for your child. So that's really out of this whole system. If a child simply has some form of special needs, as many do, that rarely has any impact on the child's school admission. So the first way in which most schools allocate in the UK is by the location and proximity of the parent's house to the school. So it's rather obvious. In very wealthy areas, you tend to get higher attaining schools. And that's how we stratify our society. It's through the location and proximity of your house to the school. And so it is important to think about if parents are in a position where they can choose where to live, and many are not, then you need to make that decision very, very carefully. So you're not just looking at the house and the bedrooms, the garden, you're looking at exactly which school catchment your home will serve, because that ultimately, particularly for primary school, will determine which school your child goes to. The second way in which schools admit in the UK, this is quite a significant proportion of schools in the UK, are religious schools, primarily Catholic and Church of England, is that they will admit giving preference to those of that religious faith. And they might ask for particular evidence of that, such as baptism certificates, church attendance, and so on. Then, of course, and in Birmingham for secondary school, certainly this doesn't apply to primary school, there is an admission on academic ability. And in that case, obviously, an examination is taken. And, you know, the score in the examination determines the entry to the school. However, in Birmingham, the King Edward VI grammar schools, those within the King Edward VI consortium, King Edward VI in their name, and they're in Birmingham, and their state schools have also introduced catchment areas in addition to the academic criteria. So they're no longer perhaps fully widely selective grammars, but they select within a catchment area. So again, you can go to the Schools of King Edward VI website, and if you're interested in this, check your catchment area for those grammars. Excuse me. Of course, then school admissions are also based on the ability of parents to pay fees. Because both primary and secondary level, we have independent schools which are fee paying. But it's worthwhile noting right now that, of course, some of these schools do offer, in some cases, very generous bursaries, and many of them offer scholarships to a certain percentage for academic, musical, or sporting ability. So although the ability to pay fees is usually a prerequisite of entering an independent private school, if you have a particularly academically able child, it is worth looking at whether, despite an inability to afford those fees, you can send your child to that school. Interestingly, I'm from Newcastle upon Tyne, and when I was 7, I went to an independent fee-paying school, but throughout my time there, I was on a 100% bursary scholarship that was funded at the time. It was part of the Conservative government's scholarship places that were funded around the country. It's not that I'm supporting them, but it was the way in which I got my education, I guess, and for which I am grateful. So it's worthwhile, just before you go into any sort of school admissions decision, opening your mind, looking around, seeing what's available, looking at a map, looking at the schools in your area, and considering all possible options. You might then decide to narrow it down, and in the end, you're going to get to the conclusion that the school that's one street away, that your community school, is the school you want to send your child to. That's absolutely fine. But it's certainly worth looking around, looking out, and opening up your options and saying, well, what really is available for my child? And again, this is such a personal decision. So my oldest son is nearly 22 now, and when he and the other children that I have got 5, but there's 3 that are, you know, one generation and 2 that are the other. When those 3 were at primary school, I lived in an area of Birmingham that's regarded as a deprived area, and I looked at a map. I looked out. I wanted, you know, a certain type of school for my children, and in the end I drove them to a village school. It was an amazing school, a state school, of course, which was around an hour drive each way, which I did madly, with 2 pregnancies and 1 labour as well, stopping with the contractions. So, you know, I'm not grateful of that, although it was difficult, because my children were able to go out of the city and get the most amazing education at that school. And I give this example simply to say, you know, it's okay to open your mind if you've got access to a car, if you're able to drive, if you look at the train routes, if you look at what's available. It's okay to open your mind and say, what else is out there? What do I really want for my child? It's also equally okay to say, this school next to my house in my community that my children can walk to, that makes things easy for us, is the right school as well. All of the options are available for you. So I'm going to move on to deciding on a school now, and I haven't given you a list of factors because these are notes that you're going to make that are personal notes. I'll simply give you a few ideas as to what perhaps you would look for when deciding on a school. Obviously, forefront of many people's minds will be the academic credentials of a school. In a moment, I'm going to show you some websites that will help you to review and to investigate and research those. Looking at the academic credentials of a school, of course, never just go on 1 year, particularly if, for example, it's a small primary school that might just have 1 class per year and 30 children. The results can vary quite widely between years because one child can mean so much in terms of the percentage that they bring to that class. So it's worthwhile looking at a number of years and seeing what the general academic credentials of a school are, and particularly thinking about a number of different points that schools are judged on. The first, of course, being the overall raw academic scores. The second one being progress, so the progress that the children make from their starting level. And the third one being, what are the academic scores? If you have a child who is more able, then what are the more able children doing? Yes, so a school might have an overall, oh yes, we get 90% of children to the average level, but how many do they get to the higher level if that's your child's ability and you want them to be in a school where they will be suitably challenged? So academic is one reason why people decide on a school. Nonetheless, however, we're aware that childhood is an extremely important part of our child's life, and ultimately, if a child is not happy and comfortable and secure and cared for at a school, then academically they'll suffer, and more importantly, they'll suffer in their whole growth as a child, and it will be a miserable experience for them. So again, it sounds like a very woolly thing, being happy. All schools will say we are a happy school. So you have to say, what is it that my child needs to be happy? Is my child a very quiet, reserved, nervous child? Would they be better off in a small, quiet school? Is my child very gregarious? They love a big, loud, noisy playground. I've got children of very different dispositions. So when I said those, I thought of different children. I thought of my fourth and my fifth, very different. And so your child is an individual who will thrive in a particular individual environment. So what matters to them? We're looking also at items such as the ethos and the values of a school, and the fact that some parents may choose the school for its faith ethos, its religious ethos as well. What are those values? What is the ethos of the school? What matters to you as a parent? So for me personally, from the age of 10, my children prayed 5 times a day. That's their faith. And that was important to me. And in fact, when I used to drive my children to that school in the countryside, my eldest son was the only Muslim in his entire key stage, not his year group, the entire juniors of the school is the only Muslim. And yet he had absolutely no problem and no difficulty taking his prayer mat at lunchtime, going into a room that was designated for him and doing his prayers. And that mattered to him and it mattered to me. However, it's no secret that there are schools within Birmingham that disallow that. They will not allow your child to pray at lunchtime. Some secondary schools have banned the Friday prayer. So this is a bit of research that you need to do yourself in terms of what matters to you. Equally, you may prefer not to have a faith school, you may prefer to have a faith school. You might not be a Catholic, but you might prefer a Catholic school for its ethos and its values. Again, some of you may be aware of Nishkan School, and I worked with them a while ago when they were first setting up, and it was an entirely positive experience. They are a Sikh faith school who welcome all faiths. And one thing I could say about that school is it had a very calm, purposeful atmosphere. And a lot of that came from the Sikh ethos and faith that was imbued throughout the school. So again, we're looking at ethos, we're looking at values, we're looking at the things that our child needs. If your child has medical or health conditions, you're going to look very carefully at how the school can manage that. You're going to look at whether you're comfortable and confident at the school's management of that condition. With special educational needs, particularly learning needs or autistic spectrum spectrum condition, then you will want to, perhaps before deciding on a school, be able to make some contact with the school and the special needs coordinator and talk about how they will meet your child's needs, because again, different schools will have very different ways of looking at this, and some will be far more understanding and better at meeting a child's needs than others. So again, then we're going to look at other things that fill out a child's life, that make it rich, things such as sport. Your child is very sporty, and some children really do need a lot of sport to stay well, and I mean mentally well. And it's been a thing that Britain has done quite well for centuries in terms of boys' sport in particular. And we know, those of us who have teenage boys, that getting involved in a sport, I'm sorry to narrow this down to boys because I know girls can do sport, but I'm just speaking as a parent of 4 boys, it really can help boys to stay on the right track throughout their teenage years if they are focused, for example, on a sport, on a team, on practice, because as they say, the devil makes work for idle hands. And if we do have our boys involved in their rugby team, their rugby practice, their rugby matches, their football, their cricket, their hockey, their tennis, their badminton, it can often be a really good thing within their lives that ensures that they do stay relatively on the right track, and that they're surrounded by coaches and people and parents who have a positive influence on them. So sport to me is not a just a little thing to add on to the side, like on the menu. For many children, it's actually very important and shouldn't be dismissed in terms of sporting opportunities. And then, of course, there's the physical benefits of being involved in sport, which will hopefully last throughout that child's life, and that's really important. Then we go on to the other wider enrichment within a child's life and into areas such as arts and drama and music, and how a school focuses on and develops those. And again, I'm a strong supporter of the arts, theatre, drama, speaking, and poetry, and if a school's providing additional extracurricular activities in this area, then that would be an enormous bonus for me, and it would be extremely important. So school is not just about that little piece of paper you get at the end with the GCSE results, the A-level results. It's about developing a child as a whole person. So again, you might have other things on your list. Maybe tell me later in terms of what is important to you about a school, but having a very clear list, maybe putting it on words so that you can swap them around and place them in order and think about these. It's really, really important as well. To some parents, being in a single gender school is also important. And of course, we have no single gender schools at primary level, not in state schools. There is Edgbaston High School for girls and West House School for boys as gendered private schools, but we do have single gender state schools, and some research has shown that particularly for girls, they can often excel more, particularly in sciences and maths, in a single gender school. So again, there's something that parents sometimes consider. Okay, moving on now to some very basic admissions deadlines. These will change slightly by a day or so every year, particularly for the primary reception place. So sometimes if the 1st of March, for example, is on a Sunday, you would get results on the 2nd, but these are the dates for this year and remain the same pretty much every single year. And these are the dates for Birmingham, but they're generally national offer dates. To apply for a secondary year 7 place in September, you apply by the 31st of October, which, as we know, is tomorrow. You can apply up to 11:59 at night. Not that I would recommend leaving it that late. Applications are online now, and anything could go wrong with the computer system. So that is not a suggestion to leave it to that point. You then receive your school offer on the 1st of March, usually by email, and then you should get a follow-up letter in the post. You need to accept that. The letter will explain clearly how to accept it by the 15th of March. Even if you decide that you want to appeal and you're not happy with your school choice, if you do not accept the place you've been offered, you will not have a school place. Accepting your offered place is not going to affect an appeal at all. It does not affect the appeal. You can accept the offer and then go on to appeal for another place. And if those for you with younger children for a primary reception place next September, you need to apply by the 15th of January. And then you'll receive your offer on the 16th of April. And this is what's really unusual in Birmingham. That offer is your school. You're put on the register. You're expected to turn up in September. You do not have to accept the place. You're just expected to be there. And so you have to, for a primary school place, refuse by the 30th of April, if that makes sense. If you look at it and say, I don't want that place, I'm going to home educate, I'm going to send my child to an independent private school, I'm going to move out of the local authority, you must refuse. And it's only ethically right to refuse if you don't want to send your child there in September to, of course, in a local authority which actually does not have enough school places for the number of children. You know, particularly in some constituencies, it would only be ethical to let them know that you're refusing the place. Similarly, with the secondary school offer, if you have decided that you're sending your child to an independent school, then as soon as possible after the 1st of March, let that school, the state school, know, as well as the local authority, so that that place can be offered to a child who is waiting for it. Okay, I'm going to move on to some very useful resources here, and I'm going to just share the screen with some of these and take you through them. So we've got the Birmingham Admissions website, which is huge. It's got an enormous amount of very useful information on it. We've got the Birmingham Admissions Booklet, which I'll go to, which can be found obviously on the website and downloaded from it. It's called the School Admissions Criteria Booklet this year. We've got the DFE, Department for Education Performance Tables, which I'll show you in a moment. And we've also got a website called Admissions Day, which can be quite useful in terms of finding schools in your area, particularly if you're near the boundary of a local authority and want to see what's over it and so on. So bear with me, because I was teaching on Zoom through the summer, but you know, I've been in person since, so I'm just getting a little rusty with Zoom, and I'm going to share the screen with you, bear with me, to show you exactly what some of those websites look like. So again, I'm just a little bit rusty today, but I'm going to take you to the School Admissions Birmingham website now. Okay, here we are. So I'm sure you've seen this. Those of you who live in Birmingham, I'm sure you've landed on it before. And obviously it has a lot of information. It's worth mentioning the 14 to 19 academies, such as, for example, the Aston Engineering College, which children can apply to and go to in year 10. You'd have to apply in year 9. So again, whichever school your child is admitted to for secondary, you do sometimes have the choice to move in year 10 to one of these 14 to 19 academies that are here. But for now, I'm just going to go into the secondary school. Hopefully you can see this. And looking at the admissions arrangements, there's a Birmingham directory, there's Birmingham and neighbouring authorities as well. And if we click view the admission arrangements for Birmingham secondary schools, this is a booklet. They used to publish it in paper. It was a really big, thick booklet. There are far more secondary schools in Birmingham now than there were then, like 10 years ago. So I imagine it would be so thick now that I certainly haven't seen a paper copy. It tends to just be online now. Of course, with the introduction of free schools and so on, we do have a huge amount more schools now. So bear with me. I'm just going to, again, a little bit rusty, but I'm just going to stop share and go to the actual booklet, which is downloaded here, and I'll show you this now. Here we are. So this is the booklet. And when you open it, you'll see that it starts off looking pretty plain and simple. But if you go through, the schools are in alphabetical order, and you can go scroll to any school that you would like clicking on it, and you can think about the schools that are available. And again, some schools have quite unusual, different admissions arrangements. Some have the ordinary, usual ones whereby it's really just done by distance. So I'm going to go and click to a very ordinary school with a very ordinary admissions. Not ordinary perhaps in the sense that it's probably the top comprehensive in Birmingham. But if I click on it, we can understand what we see in terms of the admissions criteria. It's the Arthur Terry School in Sutton Coldfield. So we can see here that it explains the published admission number. It's a large school with 270 children per year, although there's certainly larger schools than that within Birmingham. And it talks about the previous admission pattern. So if we go to 2020, the children who've just started in September, it tells you that this many children ranked the school on their preference form. The last admitted child was 1,787 metres from the school. Now, by this we mean as the crow flies, we mean a direct distance. There are websites whereby you can calculate your address as the crow flies to another address. So we're not talking about Google Maps, which will take you along the roads, which is a different distance. However, to get the absolute accurate data, particularly if you are near the boundary potentially, you do need to get in touch with Birmingham admissions, preferably by email really, from my experience. admissions@birmingham.gov.uk, and give them your address and say, how far am I from this school? And they'll be able to give you the number of metres. So that gives you an idea of where you stand in relation to that school. So then again, if we look at Arthur Terry in 2019, it was a shorter distance, probably slightly larger cohort in terms of the population in the area at that time. And then if we look at 2018, we can see these. This distance helps us to understand whether we're in with a chance or not and how far away we live. And this is your very ordinary secondary school with your very ordinary over-subscription criteria, where usually looked after children, that is children in the care of social services or social care, would have a priority in any sort of admissions arrangements. And the number of children who fit that criteria obviously extremely small. Then of course siblings will qualify for admission as a priority, and then it's children who live nearest the academy. So that's your extremely ordinary sort of school. I'm just going to go back to the page and I'll go. I'm not trying to advertise Nishcam here, but I'll go to Nishcam because it is quite an unusual admissions criteria. And if you look at it, there's quite a lot of information to take in. Like many faith schools, you have to complete an additional form for the school. In fact, many schools on this list require additional forms. Rather obviously, the grammar schools do, and the application deadline was way back in summer in order to fill in the form in order to take the examination. But many other schools who don't even have examinations have additional forms to fill in. And if you don't fill in that form as well, where it says you'll be required to complete an additional form, you will not be considered for a place at the school, even if you have put it in your list. So you do need to check whether additional forms are due in, and that's the case for primary schools as well as secondary schools. So if we have a look at Nishcam, it doesn't tell us where the people lived who are admitted to the school, because unlike your ordinary comprehensive school, it's not by distance. It gives you a statement about the ethos of the school, the vision, the multi-faith approach, and it moves on to talking about their admissions criteria. And obviously it explains the oversubscription criteria here. It's quite complicated, so we need to look at this carefully. 50% of places at Nishcam are offered to each of the following categories. So I'm just explaining how this works in front of us, with 50% of places being faith-based places, organised in that priority, and faith-based places also being available to those not of the Sikh faith, but practicing in their faith. So a Catholic who is baptized and goes to church, or a Muslim who goes to the mosque regularly, can apply for a faith place at Nishcam as long as they provide the evidence of that. Then, of course, it explains that due to COVID, you're not expected to drop in that form or go to your priest or imam and so on. You are expected to make the self-declaration completed online and so on. Then we've got category 2, which is the open places. And then we've got 50%, which are available to children who are not applying by means of faith, and they're in this priority. So somebody who applied by faith in the first section but didn't get into that 50% would still be considered for this one, again ranked by proximity to the school. Also, most appeals are administered by the local authority. It's worthwhile discussing appeals very briefly now, since we just happen to be looking at a page that talks about appeals, because I do need to say that, you know, in order for parents to make an appeal for a school place, which many parents want to do because they're upset about the school that they've been allocated, you do really need a very good reason for that appeal. It can't just be, I like that school, it is a better school, I want that school. As unfair as it may feel and seem, no appeals panel will accept an appeal without extremely good reason. The main reason that an appeal would be accepted is that the local authority made a mistake. So, for example, you might say, I made my application on time, I filled in my form correctly, I live 1 street away from the school, you're admitting up to 500 metres, I should have got a place. They made a mistake, they typed in your address wrongly. Then obviously your appeal will be accepted. The other reason for appeal might be very, very significantly extenuating circumstances, sometimes medical in regards to the parent or the child, that mean that that is the only possible school that your child could possibly go to. And again, a lot of parents do appeal for the grammar schools because they perhaps hadn't got the score for the grammar school that they wanted, or in some tragic cases were maybe just 1 point away. Again, your appeal will not be accepted unless you've got very solid evidence that something has been administered very wrongly with your child's examination, unfortunately. So anyway, this is the booklet, and that's something you probably will want to have a really good look at home. And let's move on to some of the other websites that I talked about before. I'm just going to take you now to the DFE website. That's a website that a lot of people don't necessarily know about. If you just Google DFE, Department for Education Performance Tables, this is the first thing that comes up. And we can start now to find, and can you all see the screen? Somebody let me know it's working. Yes. Hopefully you can all see the screen moving. So I'm going to click here. Instead of just searching by location or school or college name, it tends to be more useful to search by local authority. So I'll go to local authority and I'm going to type in Birmingham. And I'll look at schools in Birmingham. Hopefully you can all see. If you can't, unmute and shout. I don't know what you're doing, Rebecca. I can't see this. This is the primary performance. As you can see, 365 primary schools within the Birmingham local authority. This is secondary performance, 165 schools, a whole lot of schools there. And then of course we've got the A-level, you know, or 16 to 18 performance. So I'm going to click secondary performance here. And it's a really useful table because I can sort it. At the moment, it's automatically sorted by Progress 8 score. Progress 8 score is really looking at the progress that a child has made from when they left primary school to when they took their GCSEs. So it's tracking each individual child, tracking their progress. So again, if we sort by progress, we can see that Eden Boys School comes at the top, followed by Heartlands Academy and St. Paul's School for Girls and Al Hijra School, and then Ishcombe School. I'll be quite about Ishcombe now. However, if we want to go for raw data and just look at the actual attainment 8 score, which is looking at the top 8 GCSEs that the children have gained and the overall score between those, and of course by topic including English and maths, then the table changes a little bit. And of course, in terms of the attainment 8 score, we've got as the top school last year Sorry, I'm looking at 2019. Obviously, this is pre-COVID when everything just went slightly weird. But we're looking at 2019, and we've got Camp Hill School for Boys, followed by Camp Hill Girls, Alberhan. It's a very small independent school, as you can see. 10 children entered there for their GCSEs. King Edward's Five Ways, Bishop Vesey's, and you can read. And Eden Boys still comes highest of the comprehensives, and you can go down and down and down, going by the attainment rate. I could go here and I could sort things out by the grade 5 or above in English and Maths GCSEs, and seeing which percentage of children got this basic GCSE grade 5 in the GCSEs, and then again we're sorted, you know, by that particular percentage. Okay, and as you can see, there are many other things that I can sort the school by. I could even just sort it alphabetically as well. It's worth noting, of course, that with special schools, children will often not take the academic GCSEs as they are because that wouldn't be appropriate for them. And again, with independent schools, which are often listed here, they may take high GCSEs, which are not counted in the table, and different qualifications. So it's very difficult for you to judge an independent school from this table. I think even KES and KHS don't come high simply because they take different qualifications, not because they're high. They're obviously very academically high. So I hope that was useful. That's your DFE performance tables. And with primary, obviously it's not GCSEs or Progress 8. I can sort out the schools. This time, the table automatically sorts out the pupils in terms of percentage of pupils meeting expected standard. And we've got these listed here, 97, 93, 90%, and so on, as you go through the list. We can also see the progress score and description. So I'm looking at the progress that children make from Key Stage 1 when they finish Year 2, to the end of Key Stage 2 when they finish Year 6, and I'm checking out that progress with obviously there's a colour code there to help us too. So for example, I was interested in maths progress across Birmingham local authority. I would see that the pupils in Nelson Mandela seem to be making the most maths progress in Key Stage 2 during years 3, 4, 5, 6, and then they can go down. I mentioned higher standard earlier. So this is the percentage of pupils who achieve above age-related expectations, the percentage of pupils who get the higher expectations there. So we've got Hill West, Moorhall, these are both schools in Sutton Coldfield, followed by Moseley Church in England, which is selective in terms of faith, and more schools in Sutton Coldfield, followed by Cromwell and more schools in Sutton Coldfield. But we do have obviously a list of schools here, and these are the pupils who are achieving at a higher standard in their schools. So we can see in Hill West in that particular year, by the way, I can go back and look at 2018 and 2017 and so on this website, 32% of pupils, around a third, were achieving at a higher standard within that class. I can also look at average score in reading in terms of for those of you who've got children who've done SATs will have experience of this, the scaled scores, and I can see that these are now in order. I could change it. So unfortunately, I can go to the lowest average score, which rather unfairly, I think, puts the special schools in. But then, of course, we do have a school here which isn't a special school, and these are the lowest average scores in reading in the local authority. I could do the same for average score in maths, and you can see what's happening. So in terms of percentage of pupils meeting expected standard, I just click that triangle and I get the table the other way around, and I can see what the lower scores are, with obviously some schools in this local authority just about getting a quarter at most of their children to that basic level. So I hope that was useful. I'm going to go now to just one more website before hopefully we'll be able to take some questions. I often find that should be helpful. Maybe if you type them, I don't know what Kathleen would find easier. And I'm going to show you, bear with me, this other website, which is not a government website at all. It's called admissionsday.co.uk. I've typed in, actually, because I don't live in Birmingham, just not going to be very helpful here. I've typed in the postcode of my classroom, and now I can see, if you see how this website works, I can see the schools. I'm looking at primaries, and it's color coded by red or orange or yellow or green for outstanding, and I can see the primaries near me. I can, of course, spread out and see primaries that are further away, and I might think, oh, this is interesting, this is a green primary, it must be outstanding. And I can see this. It talks about its popularity there, 6 applications per place. With it being a Catholic school, we can expect a faith-based criteria. So now I'll go, and it hopefully will tell me the amount of miles if I pay the subscription. But again, that's something you can do for free on other websites. Here I'm going to look at a school that does not have a faith-based criteria, and I can see that they don't have data available for the catchment. It's an infant school, so I'm just going to click on the junior school. And the results show that it's a top performer. Its popularity, again, asks me to pay. I wouldn't say you have to pay because you can get this information elsewhere, but you might want to if you're on a major research mission. And the admissions criteria, again, is usually given. The usefulness of this website is the way that it very visually shows me the map, really. And I can go out, I can say, oh, I'm not too far here from the Solihull border, I'm now in Solihull. Are there any schools there for which I might meet admissions criteria? And it helps me to research and see that visually. So I hope that was useful. I'm just going to have a look at the chat and see if there are any important questions. I can't see any. So I suppose I'll hand it to Kathleen. And I'm aware that I haven't really talked in great depth about the 11 plus admissions because I wanted to make sure that this was useful to all. And so I'm just going to very quickly, perhaps whilst we're waiting for any questions to come through, share the screen here. This is admittedly my website, but I'm not advertising it. I'm showing you it because it's got a lot of useful 11 plus admissions information on it. There are 8 grammar schools within Birmingham local authority. There are others just outside of Birmingham local authority, such as the Queen Mary's Boys and Girls in Walsall. And further afield, we've got Adams Boarding School, we've got Wolverhampton Girls. We've also got grammar schools throughout Warwickshire, including Kes Stratford and Stratford Girls Grammar, which are obviously popular with those in the Solihull area, who currently, for this year, fit in with that priority circle, but that is expected to change next year as the Warwickshire Grammars shrink their priority circle. So in Birmingham, the grammar schools are state schools. They do not charge fees. The examination has taken place this year. It's usually the first Saturday of term in September, and so the examination tends to award 50% of points for child's literacy and verbal reasoning skills and 50% of points for mathematics and non-verbal reasoning skills. And parents in Birmingham obviously need to put these grammar schools on your admissions form when making that choice. So it's usually the same examination for both Birmingham and Warwickshire. So whether you apply to Warwickshire or apply to Birmingham and you tick the box to share with other schools, you will therefore be able to be admitted to all of them. In terms of the score that a child gets from their exam, it's standardized. A lot of people ask me, what is the score out of? How does this equate to a percentage? Now, I'm no mathematician, but what they do is they take all of the scores and standardize them so that the average English verbal reasoning score is 100 and the average maths non-verbal reasoning score is 100. And it depends on the spread of ability in that particular year. And so your absolutely average child will get 200. And I do not mean average in terms of national average. I mean average in terms of children who sat the examination, who will presumably generally be academically above average to want to sit the 11 plus examination. So if we look at past entry scores, we are aware that these decrease quite rapidly sometimes on the waiting list because children are offered places on the waiting list. A lot of parents will choose independent private schools and also be given a grammar school place. When they give up their grammar school place, then the waiting list begins to move. So if we have a look at the two schools that remain within Birmingham, fully widely selective and not catchment based in any way, are Bishop Vesey's Grammar, which in last year, the final score to get in was 223, although we'll notice that the year before it was 228, and St Caulfield Grammar School for Girls, which last year was 217, although you'll notice the year before was 221. However, for the King Edward VI grammar schools, there are catchments available. You can go to the King Edward VI Grammar School's website and check out your catchment by putting in your address. And we can see that within the catchment this year, a child needs to get 224 plus in order to make a place at that grammar, unless they are eligible for pupil premium, that is free school meals, in which case they need to get 205 plus and be within catchment to get the grammar. Last year on offer day, not all King Edward VI Camp Hill boys applicants within catchment were offered on offer day. They offered up to 4.7 kilometres there. So not everybody in catchment who had a high score was offered. But actually what we do know is that on the waiting list, everybody eventually was within catchment. For 5 ways, again, not all catchment pupils were offered on offer day, but up to 4.4 kilometres. And we do know that after that, from the waiting list, there were. In Camp Hill Girls, all those in catchment above 222, which was the score last year, were offered. This year it's 224, and we know that they offered out of catchment, for example, to girls in Solihull who got over 245. With Handsworth Grammar School for Girls, it was quite different. They offered widely across the region to all girls above 214. With Aston, they offered widely across the region to all boys above 213, and it was the same for Handsworth Grammar. Independent schools, of course, are generally fee paying, although I certainly know, have had children who've gone, my own children, but others, children who've gone on a full fee paid place, and that of course is based on parental income. It's an assisted place, but of course they do offer scholarships, usually 20% as well. Okay, and again, they do have music scholarships as well if a child is at a very high grade in a musical instrument. They do not offer sports scholarships, but some other independent schools around do offer sports scholarships. Okay, then we've got neighbouring authority schools. So Stratford-upon-Avon School for Boys is obviously becoming more popular as the catchment in Birmingham was introduced, with many Solihull children choosing to go there. From next year, they have proposed a change which would reduce the priority circle to sort of skim the boundaries of Solihull and therefore exclude much of Solihull from the priority circle for those schools, but they will still have 20% of places set aside for children outside that priority area. Then, of course, we've got the Walsall Grammars, which again are not linked in any way to location or catchment, but are not necessarily that easy to travel to, depending on exactly where you are in Birmingham. There is a school bus that goes via Harborne up there, but from the rest of Birmingham, it is a bit of a journey. So again, we've got Queen Mary's Grammar School for boys and girls there. That's an entirely separate examination that must be applied for separately. So I hope I've given you a little bit of information, and I'll have a look now at some of the, bear with me, I might have to go and get water.
Take your breath indeed, and I'll start reading out some of the questions. There is questions indeed coming in on the message as well as on the chat. So if I go to the message first, that has come in to me. My son got a grammar score lower than the last score admitted from the previous year. Should I still apply to that school, or would it be a wasted choice and put us at the bottom of the list for the second and third choice of schools? His score was 226. The last score from the previous year was 236. Is it worth applying?
I'm just trying to work out which grammar school they're talking about, where the last score was 236, because I don't know of any grammar school whose final score last year is 236, in all honesty. So the score was 226, and without knowing exactly where the parent lives and whether they're in a catchment, It's very difficult to. So I've got the water.
Sorry, it was her estimate.
Yes, yes. So I'm not criticizing it. I'm just trying to, yes, understand it. The question about, okay, so there's two questions here. I'll answer them slightly separately. The first question is it worth putting something on my list? And will that jeopardize my second choice? And my answer, which is applicable to all Midlands counties, not necessarily applicable to some London local authorities, but it is applicable to the entire Midlands, is no, absolutely not. So, for example, if you wanted Camphill Boys and you put it first, but you didn't have the score, and then you really liked Wheelers Lane Boys and you put it second, the fact that you maybe didn't get into Camphill Boys will not affect your ability to get into Wheelers Lane. If you fit the criteria, which in this case is a distance criteria, then you will immediately get that place. It will not affect you in any way at all. You put the schools in true order of the way that you want your child to gain admission. You put them in exactly that order without any concerns. So, for example, you know, if you put school A first and you didn't get into it, and then you got B, but you didn't get into B, and you put C, but you didn't get into C, you will be accepted for D, just as if you'd put it first. You will be fairly accepted for that school, and the schools do not know in which order you've put them, but the local authority computer system fairly goes down the list and gives you the school that you're offered. With a score of 226, you would be expected to get your catchment grammar. And the only risk would be if you're right on the edge of the catchment in terms of distance, that is a potential risk. But with a score of 226, in terms of grammar, you would obviously be, without much doubt, straight into a school such as King Edward's Aston, King Edward's Handsworth Girls, or King Edward's Handsworth Boys. And you're on the borderline for Bishop Vesey's, assuming this is a boy. Again, I'm not sure what they mean in terms of last scoring. Perhaps they're talking about Kes Stratford. So if I have a look at Kes Stratford, the last entry score last year from their records was 234. And I expect it to rise this year. But it's still worth putting on, because even if you don't get a place, you might get one off the waiting list, and you'd certainly be accepted fairly for the second choice. We're very lucky in Birmingham, you've got 6 choices. In Solihull, you've got 5 choices. You're not lucky in Worcestershire, you've got 3 choices. But that's a slight different system because of the middle school system. But with 6 choices to go, you can put them in the order that you want. I would say, obviously, make sure that somewhere on your list is a school that you are very confident your child will get into, unless you would be quite happy to send them to a private school or homeschool. If you don't want to go to a private school or homeschool, then obviously make sure that on their list there is a school that you can, according to the Birmingham admissions booklet that I showed before and previous year's entry, get into, because your child will have a school and hopefully be happy in that school.
We're not in the catchment for Camphill Boys. It came as just as part of that question before I move on to the next question.
Then if you're not in the catchment for Camphill Boys, the chance of getting a place is very low because of the new catchment criteria. So even if your child got to 280, the chance is still low. But again, put it on. Put it on. It's not impossible. It's not a 0% chance. It's just low. Put it on, and if you don't get the place, you might get it off the waiting list. And if you don't, you will be accepted without a doubt for, you know, the further schools for which you meet the criteria.
Well, thank you. I'll move on to the next question, if that's okay, because we have a few questions coming in. The question is, how long will my boys' names remain on the waiting list, as both of them are out of education since March?
Okay. If you've applied for an in-year admission, then it can be on the waiting list indefinitely. There's unfortunately not, you know, I presume the local authority has made an offer of a school. They're legally obliged to do that. It might not be a school that you can get to in terms of travel and distance. It might not be a school you want. They are legally obliged to offer a school. In terms of waiting on the waiting list, it can be indefinite. As an example, we moved, I live outside of Birmingham now, but we moved to King's Heath when my youngest son had just started reception. So just started reception, was at home. And in fact, remained at home until the beginning of year 2, which worked out to be a good thing, but it's another story. And we lived around 150 metres at most, about 120 metres from our local state school. And literally, obviously we could hear them at break time. The playground was just behind my back garden practically. You could hear and see the children. That's how close we were. At the point at which we moved house outside of Birmingham, he was in year 6, he still hadn't got a place. And this is a 120 entry school, 120 children per year who still hadn't got a place. So I'm just giving you that as an example. He did get a place at another primary school. You know, in-year admissions are extremely tricky and they're not necessarily open or fair. They are often very much controlled by the school, particularly it's a faith school, and it's a very tricky situation. And I'm going to be totally honest with you. So I had my son at home and he was just doing forest school and going to home education groups and so on. And around the end of year 1, it started to drive me a bit mad. I mean, at this point, the child could barely read, and the only thing he could write was his name. He was a very stubborn child. He's now in year 7. He's at a grammar school. So I decided that that's enough. I've been on his waiting lists for, nearly 2 years now. I'm going to go around. I went around, just pre-COVID, I could just go around places. I went around and I visited about 6 different local primary schools. I walked in and I said to them, my child has been on your waiting list. Now I feel really ashamed of this, but I'm going to be honest to you. I said, do you know, we moved to King's Heath because I've got 3 children at Camp Hill, but you know, this one, he's brighter. Now, brightness is entirely, it's subjective, given that the child couldn't read yet. But I didn't know that. Within a week, he had 5 primary school offers. Having been on the waiting list for that long, I just went in and I said those immortal words, and he had 5 primary school offers, and he did start a primary school at the beginning of year 2. So I'm sorry to give you the anecdote, but it shows you what it wants to show you. You can sit on the waiting list forever. And the overall admissions that we talked about today in terms of admission into primary school, admission into secondary school, are very, very strictly controlled and very, very fairly controlled according to the admissions criteria that we've set out. I have no doubt about that. In-year admissions are potentially a different thing, unless things have changed since then. And again, you could be waiting on the waiting list forever. It perhaps is a question of researching and looking at train routes, bus routes, car journeys, looking at schools, contacting schools directly as well.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, especially for your personal insights and their personal experiences. There's a few more questions. If you don't mind, I will just go into them. A friend's son achieved 224 and is 1 mile from HWB. I presume that means
perhaps that ends with boys' school.
So I don't know what exactly.
Yes, that's very good. I mean, obviously, it's good to get an immediate place at Handsworth Boys' School if that's the school that they put first on the list. It is really important to put schools in the right order. So, for example, I actually knew of a case of a father whose daughter, this is years ago, got a very high score in the 11 plus, would have got into Camp Hill Girls. The father was a little bit unsure how to do the admissions form, and he decided to put Moseley School first because they lived near it and he was worried about not getting in. And then he put King Edward's Camp Hill second. The daughter obviously got Moseley School because they met the criteria for it. Was the first on the list and they met the criteria. They were not allowed to appeal for Camp Hill Girls because you can't appeal for a school that is lower than the one you've been given. You could only appeal for a school that was higher on your list than the one you had been given. So the daughter went to Moseley School. So it is really important to put schools in the order that you want. So this child on 224, put Handsworth Boys' School first if that's your first choice school, and should get a place without any problems because last year all boys up to 213 got a place.
Wow. there's a few questions here. Do you think scores will go down this year as results seem to be lower than previous years? And I'll just bring in the next question as well. Can you talk briefly about the appeal process?
Okay, no, the results I don't think have gone down. The children's academic ability may have been affected by COVID and may very likely have been affected by COVID. But the results are standardized, so the average child still gets 200. So I don't expect results to go down this year. Obviously, the foundation, King Edward VI Foundation, have set the entry score at 224 or 205 for pupil premium children. I personally, I don't have a Palantir here, but I personally think that Bishop Vesey's Sutton Girls and the Stratford School scores are likely to rise a little at least. It's impossible to say though, I could be wrong, yes, but that's just my opinion. In terms of the appeals process, you can't appeal until you've got your school. So you have to wait until the 1st of March, then you're allocated a school. And then you decide, I don't want that school, I wanted a school that I had put higher on my list that I have not gained admission to. And then you ask, the information will be there on your letter in terms of asking for an appeals form and filling in the form. And then appeals are held in the summer term. So again, you have to wait a few more months for appeals to be held. You'll go to an appeals panel, which are usually volunteers, often with an educational background, but not always, but they will have been trained in hearing appeals. And you will have to convince the appeals panel either one of two things. You'll either have to convince them, one, that the local authority acted wrongly in their admission, that they've made a mistake essentially, and had the criteria been followed, you should have got the school. Or alternatively, number two, you'll have to convince them that your child can only attend that school. And that is, the school that your child needs to attend. Appeals for the grammar schools are very, very, very rarely accepted. They really are. I'm just being honest before you go through, the stress and the difficulty of it. A lot of parents had got in touch with me, not necessarily my pupils, but just general parents saying, oh, I'm not happy with my score, they're just one off, they, could have got it, I'm going to appeal. And I say to them, well, what is your reason for appealing? And you need a reason. You actually really need a very good reason, and that reason needs to be backed up with a lot of evidence. So for example, if it's a medical reason, you need a lot of evidence. Now, when a child sits the 11 plus, parents for this reason are asked to hand in a form to say, my child is well and taking the exam. So it's very difficult after that to say, oh, my child felt ill, that's why they didn't do so well. It wouldn't really hold up in appeal. It would have to be something pretty exceptional. One thing that might hold up in appeal potentially is if a child made a mess of the answer sheet and that was remarked and that was looked at and that was seen to be very clear and true, that, if the answer sheet was marked by hand, they would have actually got a higher score because they didn't indent it dark enough or something like that. That's one potential reason. But appeals generally very, very, very rarely succeed for any type of school, I'm afraid. I'm just being honest. But when you do go to the appeals meeting, you sit down in front of the panel and obviously have a chance to present your case. And you'll also be asked to provide evidence beforehand, such as medical or academic evidence before that. There is a book you can buy if somebody's really very serious and interested in 11 plus appeals from AU Publications. There is a book on 11 plus appeals that you can buy if that's something you really do want to do.
Wonderful, thank you. There's still more questions coming in, and I don't know if you're reading them or not.
Yes, I'll have a little look. Yes.
Yeah. So
a lot of people ask me, what is the last date to move? Unfortunately, that's not even clearly published. It's a little bit woolly. If you're planning to move house, you still need to apply by the 31st of October, by tomorrow. You still need to apply. So even if you are about to move house on the 2nd of November, You need to apply according to your address now. You need to get that application in. Otherwise, it will be classed as a late application. So the application must be in according to your current address that you're sitting in on the 31st of October. Later on, you can move and you can change address. And usually they will accept that up until Christmas. Again, it's woolly, and this is something that, because of your specific situation, you need to, contact admissions at birmingham.gov.uk to clarify, or you need to give them a call, or you need to call your own local authority or contact them to check this. My personal experience is that I moved house last November, and my son was in year 6, so it was during the admissions timescale. So I had made my application. And I made my application, to be honest, the school that I wanted for him as first choice, which very fortunately he's in now, is a grammar school that does not have any catchment criteria. So I guess it wasn't hugely important, but I placed this down, and I also placed schools down that are comprehensive within the area that I knew I was going to move to. I then moved in mid-November, but I had applied with Birmingham admissions by the correct date. I moved to a different local authority. I moved to Staffordshire, and I then contacted Staffordshire local authority. I said, I've applied on time with Birmingham. I've moved to your local authority. This is my address. And then they organised the transfer to their admission system. And on the 1st of March, it was the 2nd actually, I got the information from Staffordshire as to which school had been allocated, if that makes sense. So I can give you my experience of moving, obviously, after the admissions date, in which case it was transferred, but still regarded as an on-time application because I had made it on time. If you're going to wait and move in, say, February, March, or even after March, this is something you need to discuss with the local authority. So somebody might move after March, and therefore the whole thing will change in terms of where they sit on waiting lists. But again, this is a very personal question. It depends if you're moving within or without a local authority. It depends on how the local authorities communicate. So you need to individually check that. Yes.
Yes, you've answered some of the questions about putting on schools, comprehensive schools and grammar schools, so I don't need to read out that question for you and move on to another one. What advice do you have for parents concerned that Camp Hill Boys is possibly a high-pressured environment for boys of a quieter disposition? I'm not too sure if you want to go into that in this webinar or not.
I can't see it here. Did you say highly pressured? Is that what?
Highly pressured environment.
Pressured. Okay. Again, I really, for those who choose to go down the selective school route, I respect that, and I respect all of the work and effort that actually does tend to have to go into going down that route. But I also equally very, very much respect parents who make a choice not to do that. I do respect that choice, and it depends on you, your values, your own thoughts on education. It depends more than anything on your child and how your child is. I would, however, say there's something else that can sometimes go on, and this may not be the case at all with this particular questioner, but I have seen sometimes that families, perhaps who are not from a background where they've had higher education, feel that a certain school is not for them or not for their child. And I would say that never feel that. Yes, smash the ceiling, smash the boundaries, and aim for the very highest level of excellence that you wish to aim for. Don't let anybody say to you, our community don't go to those schools, this is not for us. And sometimes there can be issues with jealousy from other people when your child gets into a highly selective school. Well, that's not sometimes, it's quite regularly actually. But sometimes people out of jealousy can say to you, no, that school's not for your child, that school's not for us. And I just want to sort of push all of that to the side and say, what is it that you and your heart want to do? What is academic ability anyway? I'm a very strong believer that children aren't, obviously if we take out special educational needs or special needs, I'm a strong believer that children aren't born with a particular academic ability. And in all of my experience, I strongly believe that it really is just a process of the work and the effort that a child puts in. that's my experience with hundreds of children, that really it boils down to your level of work and organisation. So what is really going to allow a child to thrive at grammar school is their attitude to learning and how much hard work they want to put in. That's what's going to allow them to thrive at any school, really, and allow them to attain academic excellence. It doesn't really boil down to intelligence at the end of the day. Ultimately, if a child's got the right score for Camp Hill Boys, why should they not manage in Camp Hill Boys? Yeah, there might be other reasons. You might say, oh, you know, my child has particular needs, they need to be in this other particular school, and that's fair enough. But if a child has got the score, then there's nothing that tells me that they won't thrive. Again, everything from a very young age boils down to time and effort and attitude, more than anything else. There's a book called Bounce by Matthew Said. And by the way, Matthew Said's written a number of children's books. They are amazing. They are brilliant. Great gift to give if you sort of wanting to gift anything to any children in your life. He's written children's books called You're Awesome, and other books where children can keep a diary and think about achievement and attitude and hard work. But the book Bound that I'm talking about was written quite some years ago, and it's more of an academic book for adults. And it talks about how, and by the way, Matthew Said was an Olympic table tennis champion. It talks about the psychology of success and the psychology of doing well. And it talks, there was one particular study where it looked at violinists in Europe, and it divided the violinists, these are top violinists who play the violin, into three categories. The ones who were the top solo players in top orchestras, the ones who were in the top orchestras, and the ones who didn't make it to the top orchestras, and maybe they were working as violin teachers and so on. So divided into these three categories. There's this huge amount of research, and it asked them to go back to their childhood and essentially made a calculation of how many hours they had spent practicing the violin. The results were stark. The ones who had spent the most hours practicing the violin were the soloists. The ones who spent the medium amount of hours practicing the violin were in the orchestras. And the ones who had spent the lowest amount of hours practicing the violin were not in the orchestras. And the same can really be applied in many cases. I suppose, yes, there's perhaps a certain level of intelligence, but you're talking about that counts for maybe 5%. 95% of what a child achieves will come from their attitude, their effort, their home environment, the books that they have, the way that they are exposed to vocabulary, academia, education. It's going to come from that. So sorry that I started talking a lot, but if you're asking if a child can cope in a selective school, any school will just boil down to how much effort and work that child is prepared to put in.
Mashallah. Thank you for that. I'll just read one question before we go over to Asma, who maybe want to take off her mic to ask you something. So just before we go over to Asma, can one, once the submitted application form has been submitted, can one amend that before tomorrow's deadline?
Yes, you usually can go back in and amend it at any point up until 11:59 tomorrow. But when you amend, please make sure you click the button to submit the amendments to make sure that that has been saved.
Asma, would you like to take off your mic and ask Rebecca a question? You have your hand up. Maybe not. I'll continue on in the meantime. My daughter went to a faith school. Does that affect her entry to you as an oversight compared to a non-faith schools?
No, there are some schools which are all through schools in Birmingham now, such as Waverley School. You don't even apply for year 7, you just automatically go from year 6 to year 7. They are all through schools. So assuming that you're not in an all through school, there are only a few of these. The primary school, it can. I mean, for example, if you're at Nishcam primary school, it gives you a priority to Nishcam secondary school. And certain Catholic schools, such as Bishop Challoner in King's Heath, will give priority to children from certain Catholic schools that are in the locality, such as St Albans. So it can affect entry to faith schools. Sometimes that can give a child a priority, even if they're not in that faith. So again, I would go back to that Birmingham booklet that I showed at the beginning and look at the school. For example, particularly if you're looking to go to a faith school, and see whether the fact that your child was in a faith primary school will give them an additional allocation, raise on the admissions criteria. However, if you're simply applying for a non-faith school, then being in a faith school won't affect it. And again, similarly, being home educated in primary won't affect it either.
Oops, the questions are moving all over the place on me.
Yes,
Sorry.
I can see one. I've got a private question actually, sorry, and it's from somebody who is, I just wanted to answer it to try to help their brother or sister. They're Syrian refugees, and since March they have been on the waiting list for Eden Boys. And my understanding from the question is that they have 2 boys who are in different age groups, and obviously they've made an in-year application. The council has offered 2 school names, but they do not want these schools. They want a faith school, and they moved to Birmingham from Bristol. Anyway, my advice would be that if you might want to try appeal. It's the only thing that's available to you is to go to appeal. And because of your situation of being refugees, and because of the boys' situation, the appeals panel may look favourably upon that. I cannot promise. The only possible action left to you ultimately is appeal. And if you've exhausted appeal, again, to look around and to see what else might be available for you, and to think, even if you accept another school for your child, but you really wanted a different one, it won't affect their waiting list place. You will still have a fair place on that waiting list. You can still go. Sometimes people say, okay, I'm just not going to send my child to a school. I'm going to keep them at home, because that means that the school will feel I have to take them. It will give me a better chance of appeal. It will give me a better chance on the waiting list if I don't send them to any school. That is not the case at all. And I would say to parents that obviously home education is always an option. It is an available option, but you really need to look at whether you want to take that option and whether the option works for you. Have you got the support that you need? Can you manage to go through that option? It's not an easy option at all. I've done it myself with my children for various years, in and out here and there, and I did it because I had a supportive community. I had the ability to do that, but I have seen families and mothers in particular really struggle and almost crumble under the pressure. And I would say that ultimately your child needs you to be happy and healthy, well, comfortable. You need downtime. You can't try to manage everything yourself. Sometimes, particularly if you've got a large family, no extended family, or you're single, or your partner works very long hours. Look at all of these before making the decision to home educate. And to home educate and then decide to send your child to school is not a capitulation. That the time that you had with your child, that extra time is really important. But I know Kathleen will say more than me, that ultimately parenting comes from yourself as parents and your position of strength and health and comfort, and your child needs you to be happy and healthy more than anything else. So I hope, and fortunately, I'm aware of so many really sad cases in Birmingham with regards to school admissions. I really am. It's just the reality of, and these cases usually happen when families move to Birmingham in between a school cycle. So these are in-year admission situations. And I've known of mothers who've got 9 children who are crisscrossing, don't have any transport. They're crisscrossing on buses around the city, trying to take these children to different schools. They're all an hour late, they're exhausted. These situations are real, and that's one way in which I hope that this has been useful. If you know anybody, if you work in any position with the community, with families, if you have neighbours, if you have relatives, please reach out and do say to them, do you know the admissions deadline? Put it on all of your WhatsApp groups. The admissions deadline for secondary schools is tomorrow. Please apply by then, because if families, for example, they're new to the city, they don't speak English, they haven't heard about the deadline, and they miss it, they're regarded as a late admission, and they could end up with a school 10 miles away and 3 bus rides away. So it is a sad situation. And again, each one of us here, and I know that many of us are looking at the names, they are professionals who might be looking at the 11+ system, but that's not to detract that within the city, each one of us has a responsibility to get the message out and to help everybody to get a school space that suits them.
Thank you, Rebecca. There's some questions I think you have answered already. There's one here about, can you please let me know if the score is less than priority? Is it best to pick the catchment or out of catchment, closer school? Or do you have to put a comprehensive school, or can you use all the spaces for grammar school? Score is closer to out of catchment. And then there was also a question about a book, if you could recommend a book for the 11+, and maybe explain or give somebody a reference of where to go to find out more about comprehensive school. They're asking what is a comprehensive school. But we're going to have to wind up with those last 3 questions indeed, inshallah, if that's okay with you.
So again, in terms of managing your catchment and your 6 schools that you have, in terms of managing those, well, really, it's just, you've got 6 choices. You just have to make sure that one of those choices is a choice that you know your child will get into. So whatever you scored, if you really like Campbell Boys, or put it first. It's not going to harm your other choices. Just make sure that one of your 6 choices is a choice that you know from previous years you can get into. And I'm just going to, I know that some of you may have joined the meeting late. At the beginning, I showed everybody a few websites, and I just want to go back to this booklet that I showed that is available as a download from the Birmingham admissions website. Again, you know, it's about going through this very carefully, looking at all of the possible scores and looking at the criteria and looking at the choices. So we haven't had time to do that today, but it is important that, you know, we take our time to go through those and fully understand what the choices were. So for example, if lots of people talk about Campbell, if I click on this, it talks about the admissions policy statement in detail. It gives you a link to their website where you can get more information and so on. If we're talking about ordinary comprehensive schools, which generally admit according to the locality of the parents, for example, the one that I showed you before was the Arthur Terry, because it's a very standard admission criteria. It will generally be in terms of the location of the child and the distance of that child from the school. So here we've got Holyhead School, which is in Erdington, and it talks about the preferences and how, for example, last year you had to live around 1 kilometre from the school to get a place. Again, I just want to, just in case some of you have joined a little bit later, go back to the DFE performance tables, which again is really important. And I'm just going to click on secondary performance here and show you how you can go into the, please click on local authority to sort through the whole of the local authority. And then you can click on, for example, you know, the Progress 8 score, or for the overall score, of course, the Attainment 8 score, and see those scores within your local authority. You could go to Solihull and check it for that local authority as well. You may notice that I haven't really discussed Ofsted and Ofsted reports, and that's because I don't look at Ofsted reports. Okay, but I've given you my advice in terms of looking at the overall. I mean, you might want to, just as a little bit of information. You could make your own decision as to the credibility of them. And it's the DFE website that's going to give you the actual real facts and figures here. And of course, you're going to look at the school website and see what they have to say as well.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much for that informative, very informative session.